The first explosion didn't come from the border. It came from the center of town. Phones rang through smoke. Doors collapsed inward. And somewhere between the first scream and the second strike, people realized something terrifying. This place had never been meant to be touched. And now it had been chosen. Before the attack, the city believed in distance. Not safety. Distance. Violence existed, everyone knew that, but it existed elsewhere. In regions spoken about cautiously. In places shown briefly on television, always introduced with phrases like remote, isolated, volatile. The terrorist group had a reputation, but also a pattern. They stayed where they were strong. They struck where they could disappear afterward. They did not strike here. That belief shaped everything. Markets opened early, as they always had. Vendors argued over prices the same way they had for years, their voices overlapping in familiar rhythms. Children walked to school in small clusters, memorizing routes that felt permanent. Phones rang constantly, work calls, family calls, reminders of ordinary life continuing without interruption. Time moved predictably. There were rumors, of course. There always are. People spoke quietly about military vehicles passing at night. About unfamiliar aircraft overhead, too fast, too high, too quiet. About foreign advisors arriving discreetly, never photographed, never officially acknowledged. But fear is expensive. People ration it. The city had learned to live beside danger without touching it. And so the rumors stayed rumors. They didn't change routines. They didn't change where people stood or how long doors stayed open. Distance still felt intact. The belief wasn't that nothing bad could happen. It was that this wasn't where it would happen. That belief was reinforced by silence. Officials said little. Media coverage stayed vague. The absence of warning became its own reassurance. Nothing felt urgent enough to demand action. And that is how fear works best, when it is postponed. On the morning of the attack, nothing felt different. The air smelled like dust and fuel, the same as always. Shopkeepers unlocked doors they'd unlocked hundreds of times before. A man argued with his phone provider over a dropped call. A woman stood in line counting change twice, annoyed at herself for being distracted. Phones rang. Doors opened. Life continued under the assumption that it always would. What no one realized, not yet, was that decisions had already been made far away. That conversations had already happened in rooms without windows. That coordinates had already been chosen. The city was still alive. But it had already been selected. The first blast erased sound before it created it. For a fraction of a second, everything went silent, an unnatural pause where the body recognized danger before the mind could name it. Then the pressure arrived. The ground lifted. Glass bent inward. Metal screamed. People were thrown forward without understanding why. Some ran immediately, instincts taking over before fear could catch up. Others froze, caught in the terrible stillness that follows shock. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like confusion. There was no warning. No sirens. No evacuation order. Nothing to signal that this moment had been planned. The explosion tore through the center of the market, the very place people had believed was untouchable. Stalls collapsed. Signs disappeared in clouds of dust. Fire followed slowly, deliberately, as if it had been waiting its turn. Phones began ringing almost instantly. Missed calls stacked up on cracked screens. Emergency lines connected briefly, then dropped. People shouted names into smoke, hoping someone would answer back. And then, before the city could even understand what had happened, the second strike landed. Closer. More precise. This wasn't chaos. It was sequence. People who had started running stopped abruptly, unsure which direction still existed. Exits had changed shape. Buildings had changed purpose. Doorways that once led to safety now led to rubble. Fear spread faster than fire. Not because of what people saw, but because of what they didn't understand. Why here? Why now? Why twice? Later, officials would say the target was a terrorist cell operating nearby. That intelligence, shared by a powerful foreign ally, had confirmed the presence of high-value operatives. That delay would have meant disaster. But in those moments, none of that existed yet. All that existed was impact. A man crawled out from beneath a collapsed awning, his phone still ringing in his pocket. A woman screamed for her child, then went silent when she found him standing frozen a few steps away, unharmed but unable to speak. Fear does strange things to time. Minutes stretched into something unrecognizable. People couldn't tell how long they'd been trapped, or how long they'd been running. Smoke erased landmarks. Sound became unreliable. When the noise finally settled, the city looked unfamiliar. Not destroyed, violated. The kind of damage that doesn't feel accidental. Within hours, statements were released. The strike had been successful. The operation had been necessary. Civilian casualties were regrettable but unavoidable. The words were calm, controlled, rehearsed. They arrived faster than understanding. Foreign officials confirmed cooperation, intelligence sharing, precision capabilities. They emphasized restraint, legality, and partnership. What they did not explain was why there had been no warning, or why the targets were said to be mobile, but the strike had landed in the same place twice. Phones continued ringing long after the smoke cleared. Some calls were never answered. By nightfall, soldiers had sealed off the area. Journalists were kept at a distance. Residents were told to stay inside, for their own safety. Fear settled into the city, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy. It sat in the silence between phone calls, in the hesitation before opening doors, in the way people looked at the sky longer than they used to. Because something had changed. Not just physically, psychologically. The city had crossed an invisible line, and no one yet understood what that meant. The next morning, officials said the threat was gone, but the phones kept ringing. And somewhere nearby, a camera, powered by a generator, had kept recording the entire time. By the third day, the story felt settled. Not proven, settled. Officials spoke with certainty now, no longer hedging their language. The strike, they said, had eliminated a critical node in a terrorist network. Intelligence from a foreign military partner had confirmed the presence of high-ranking operatives. The decision had been urgent. The risk had been immense. They emphasized prevention. What could have happened, they warned, would have been far worse. The media followed the lead. Headlines repeated phrases like precision, partnership, necessary force. Analysts filled airtime with maps and arrows, explaining how terror networks embed themselves among civilians, how modern warfare leaves no clean choices. Fear needs justification to feel manageable. And for many, this explanation was enough. The public wanted to believe that the chaos had a purpose, that the smoke had meaning, that the lives disrupted, or ended, had been caught in something unavoidable. It was easier than believing otherwise. In the days following the strike, attention shifted quickly. From the attack itself to the threat it supposedly prevented. From the market to hypothetical bombings that never happened. From visible destruction to invisible enemies. That shift mattered, because it reframed the victims. They were no longer people who had been struck. They were people who had been near a target. Language softened responsibility. Investigators announced preliminary findings. They stated there was no evidence of wrongdoing. The operation had followed protocol. Civilian presence, they explained, was unfortunate but unavoidable given the tactics of terrorist groups. The phrase repeated everywhere. They hide among civilians. It became a shield. Anyone who questioned the strike was met with the same response. Would you rather they strike first? Fear policed the conversation. Families of the injured were advised to remain patient. Compensation discussions would come later. For now, authorities said, unity mattered more than scrutiny. And for a time, people complied. Because fear does something else. It narrows focus. People worried about their own safety first. They changed routes home. They avoided crowded places. They answered phones more cautiously, or not at all. Questions felt dangerous. But beneath the surface, discomfort grew. Witnesses compared notes quietly. They spoke in kitchens and hallways, away from open windows. They described what they had seen before the strike. Nothing unusual. No armed presence. No strange meetings. No signs of a cell preparing an attack. Just people buying food, talking, arguing over prices. Those conversations didn't make the news. They circulated privately. Then the footage emerged. Not officially. Not announced. Shared hand to hand. A small shop on the edge of the market had remained powered during the blackout. Its security camera had kept running. The footage showed the hours before the attack. Clear. Stable. No weapons. No convoys. No suspicious gathering. Just civilians moving through time as they always had. The timestamps were unmistakable. They didn't align with the official version. When journalists finally asked about the footage, the response was immediate and dismissive. Officials called it incomplete, contextless, misleading. They said intelligence could not be shared publicly. They said trust was required. Then the footage vanished from public platforms, taken down for verification. It never returned. Fear shifted shape again. Because now it wasn't just about violence. It was about who controlled the story. And who benefited when doubt disappeared. The first crack wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Emergency call data, released weeks later as part of a routine disclosure, showed something strange. Calls flooded in immediately after the first strike, but many never connected. Some were delayed by minutes. Others dropped entirely. At first, this was explained as network overload. Then technicians noticed something else. Bandwidth throttling had occurred. Not a complete shutdown. Just enough to slow information. Just enough to prevent real-time coordination. Just enough to keep the narrative contained. Authorities denied intentional interference. They cited technical irregularities. Foreign partners declined to comment. But fear doesn't need confirmation to take hold. People remembered how quiet it had felt, even as chaos unfolded. How phones rang without answers. How help seemed slower than expected. The silence hadn't been accidental. Then came the behavioral shift. In the weeks after the attack, officials became more visible, but less accessible. Press conferences increased. Direct answers decreased. Statements grew longer, more detailed, more rehearsed. Grief was acknowledged, but only briefly. Control followed immediately. Witnesses who spoke too openly found themselves corrected publicly. Not threatened. Corrected. Their accounts reframed as confusion. Trauma. Misinterpretation. Fear doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives as condescension. Filming near the site was discouraged. Again, politely. For safety. For stability. For unity. People complied. Because by then, the lesson had been learned. This place could be struck. And no one would stop it. Then a pattern emerged. Satellite imagery, analyzed quietly by independent researchers, showed altered flight paths days before the strike. Foreign military assets had repositioned. Surveillance intensified. Advisors arrived earlier than officially acknowledged. This hadn't been reactive. It had been prepared. The city wasn't struck because terrorists had arrived. It was struck because the conditions allowed it, because the risk of backlash was low, because the partnership was strong, because fear could be managed. And then, inevitably, it happened again. Another strike. Another city. Same language. Same justification. Different civilians. The public response was muted this time. Not because people didn't care, but because fear had already done its work. Investigations were announced again. Findings repeated earlier conclusions. No wrongdoing. No accountability. Shared responsibility spread thin enough to disappear. Silence became the final outcome. Those who suffered the most learned something painful. The strike wasn't the end of terror. It was a demonstration of power, of reach, of how easily boundaries could dissolve. Fear didn't just follow the attack. It became policy. The city rebuilt quickly. Markets reopened. Doors were repaired. Phones resumed ringing. But something remained broken. Because everyone now understood the same thing. If it could happen here once, it could happen anywhere. By the time the second city was struck, fear no longer needed an explanation. It already knew where to live. The response followed the same script as before. Statements released within hours. Carefully balanced language. Reassurances that the operation had been necessary, measured, and based on credible intelligence. Foreign partners confirmed cooperation. Domestic authorities echoed unity. What changed was the public reaction. There was no shock this time. No mass confusion. No frantic searching for meaning. People understood the shape of what was happening now. They had seen it once already. The pattern didn't announce itself loudly. It revealed itself in repetition. In sameness. In the way every justification sounded almost identical to the last. Precision. Prevention. Regret. Always regret. But never responsibility. Independent analysts began comparing incidents. Quietly. Away from press briefings. They mapped locations, timing, and response patterns. What emerged was unsettling. The strikes followed opportunity, not urgency. They occurred where civilian density was high enough to create impact, but low enough to avoid international outrage. They followed intelligence cycles rather than threat cycles. Surveillance intensified days before each attack. Media access tightened immediately afterward. Fear wasn't collateral damage. It was a variable. One analyst described it simply. The fear response was predictable, and therefore usable. Civilians weren't just caught in the middle. They were the middle. Fear reshaped behavior faster than policy ever could. People avoided gatherings. They limited movement. They shared less online. They spoke more carefully. Suspicion replaced solidarity. And none of it required force. That was the most effective part. The foreign military power involved never appeared directly. No flags. No boots on the ground. Just assistance. Technology. Intelligence. Distance maintained. Plausible deniability preserved. Responsibility diffused. And when questions surfaced about escalation, about whether these strikes were creating more instability than they prevented, the answers were always abstract. Security is complex. Threats evolve. We act based on the information available. Fear absorbed the rest. Inside the affected cities, daily life adapted around the expectation of interruption. Markets reopened with wider aisles. Schools revised schedules. People learned to read the sky. Children learned the sound of aircraft before they learned geography. Phone calls changed tone. Missed calls meant more than inconvenience now. They meant possibility. They meant silence that could stretch too long. Fear had embedded itself into routine. And that was when something else became clear. The terrorist group, supposedly the target, had not disappeared. In fact, it had adapted too. Recruitment messaging shifted. Propaganda reframed the strikes as proof of foreign domination, of civilian disregard, of injustice without accountability. Fear worked both ways. The strikes didn't end the threat. They multiplied it. But by then, the machinery was already moving. Stopping would require admitting something no one wanted to admit. That fear had been chosen. Investigations were announced again. They always were. Independent panels. Internal reviews. Statements promising transparency. Each one concluded the same thing: no violations. No misconduct. No grounds for further action. The language was clean. Too clean. Families of those killed or injured were offered compensation. Quietly. Without ceremony. Often with conditions attached. Acceptance meant closure. Silence. An agreement not to pursue further inquiry. Some accepted because they needed to survive. Others refused because they needed to remember. Most said nothing at all. The markets filled again over time. Not fully. Not the way they once had. But enough to appear normal to outsiders. Doors were replaced. Walls repainted. Scars covered but not erased. The city looked intact. But the phone habits never returned to what they were. People answered more cautiously. They called back immediately. They noticed when someone stopped calling altogether. Because now, silence meant something else. Journalists moved on. Attention shifted to newer crises. Other regions. Other emergencies. The story faded into archives, accessible but rarely revisited. That was the final success of the operation. Not the strike. The forgetting. No one was ever charged. No official apology was issued. No acknowledgement of error entered the record. Justifications remained intact. Partnerships strengthened. Capabilities expanded. Fear had proven effective. And effective tools are never retired. The unanswered questions lingered quietly. What if the intelligence was wrong? What if the threshold for action had changed permanently? What if the city was chosen not because it was dangerous, but because it was convenient? Those questions never received answers. They didn't need to. Fear doesn't require certainty. It only requires precedent. Years later, people still speak about the attack, but carefully. As a reference point. A dividing line. Before and after. Before doors closed sooner. Before phones were checked obsessively. Before people learned that distance could disappear overnight. The city still exists. It still breathes. But it listens now. To the sky. To the silence. To the pauses between phone calls. Because it learned something the hard way. The attack didn't change everything because of what it destroyed. It changed everything because of what it taught. That fear works. And once it does, it doesn't stop. The market still opens every morning. The doors still unlock. But everyone knows now. Silence is never empty.